why would you critique the very thing that you think God chose as the means to bring those elect people to salvation?
There's a driving desire that's twisted to reach the culture.
A driving desire to reach the culture. That's another word, a driving desire to evangelize. A driving desire to reach the culture, a driving desire to evangelize, a driving desire to reach the world, a driving desire to make disciples, a driving desire. Again, he's speaking on the cuff here, is being interviewed. So I want to give him the benefit of the doubt. But a driving desire to reach the culture? Do we really want to tell pastors not to have a driving desire to reach the culture? I'm trying to give him the benefit of the doubt here. I think maybe what he's meaning to say, or what he's trying to emphasize in the whole of this interview, is that sometimes an overwhelming driving desire to reach the culture leads a church away from feeding the sheep. Because you're not focusing on feeding the sheep the way you should, you're focusing upon reaching the people outside the built walls, that you have neglected feeding the sheep. And to that I could say, yes, there needs to be an appropriate balance between reaching the culture, impacting your world, and feeding the sheep. It's my department in evangelism. The Center for Church Health has a discipleship department led by David Adams. I am the evangelism department led by Leighton Flowers. Okay, there are two different departments: discipleship and evangelism. One is reaching the lost; the other is discipling the saved. And so I'm on the evangelism side of things, so I know where my heart passion is, and so I'm going to defend the impact your culture part of things. I get it. And maybe if David Adams were here, the man who heads the discipleship partner, he might be high-fiving MacArthur on some of this, going, yeah, we need to do more about discipling the saved. And I get it. And it's not an either-or concept, obviously. And I don't think MacArthur would say it's an either-or concept either. Honestly, don't. But this is the shift, I think, that you'll see begin to play out in culture among the quote-unquote Reformed Calvinistic folks. Because there's a reason there's the nickname of the frozen chosen. Because Calvinism tends to, not always, but tends to become more and more inward focused in on itself, and less focused on impacting the culture. Why? Because God decrees whatsoever comes to pass. God's going to decree his elect to be his elect, and they're going to get saved regardless of what happens. In fact, I wrote down what you're going to hear MacArthur say just in a second, because I want you to see it and hear it when he says it. It's on the screen there at the bottom. He says, we aren't going to accomplish anything that the Lord hasn't already decreed. Here, he's about to say that here in a minute. And the reason I want to put it up there is because I want you to listen to it in the context of what he's talking about with, there's this emphasis on reaching the culture. There's this emphasis on outside the walls. And listen to what he's saying. He's saying, God's decreed that. God's already decreed. We're not going to accomplish anything outside the walls that God hadn't already decreed. And so what we need to be doing is feeding the sheep. We need to be feeding the elect. We need to be focusing on feeding the elect people. And my whole point through all of this, that he's saying this, is I'm going, well, they're going to feed the elect as much as God decrees for them to feed the elect. MacArthur? Rick Warren was decreed by God to seek after the lost. Andy Stanley and Tim Keller, who you're going to go over to critique here in a little bit, they were decreed to do what they're about, what they're doing, according to your statements of faith. And yet you're critiquing them for doing what you believe God decreed for them to do. And you believe Tim Keller, I know, is a Christian. I don't know. I assume you would believe the Stanleys are Christians as well. And so God decreed his own children, some of his own children, I guess, to focus too much on impacting culture. And he's critiquing them for doing that. Again, that's what doesn't make rational sense about this whole conversation.
You can go back to Tim Keller's mandates for urban renewal, or Andy Stanley welcoming all the homosexuals because he wants to reach them. But pastoral ministry is not about changing the culture. And if you define it theologically, your church will never have anyone who's a genuine member who's not part of the remnant. We're not going to accomplish anything that the Lord hasn't already decreed. And I don't.
Okay, there's where he said it. So he's saying it in the context of critiquing Andy Stanley's approach. And by the way, I'm not here to discuss all of the different things that Andy Stanley or Tim Keller or Rick Warren or any of these other pastors have said and done. I have disagreements with all of them, I'm sure, and they have disagreements among themselves about all different kinds of things. And I'm sure we could bring critique about all of them on one level or another about this, that, or the other. That's not what this is about. What I'm talking about here is, one, we're going to get to the remnant in a minute. That'll be what we end with, really focusing on what does the Bible say about the remnant, and who is a part of the remnant. What's that Bible talking about? We'll get there. What I'm really wanting to focus on, at least in this section, is this concept and idea of the shift that's taking place of understanding that in the mind of MacArthur, the remnant are the unconditionally elected ones that were chosen before the foundation of the world unilaterally. I would say arbitrarily, based upon the way Edwards used the word arbitrary, the way Calvin used the word arbitrary, meaning that God unilaterally picked people before they were ever born for reasons that are just not revealed to us, the secret counsel of God's will. He chose certain people, and those are the remnant. And the pastors, you need to start focusing on the remnant. You need to start focusing on the elect ones, because that's what you're called to do. And stop putting so much focus on reaching the lost, because God's already decreed. We're not going to accomplish anything that the Lord hasn't already decreed. And so you need to start doing your job and focus on the elect people. That's basically what I hear MacArthur saying here. And that's consistent with Calvinism. It really is. It's very consistent with the way Calvinism tends to go, is guy that critiques people who are reaching the lost too much. And it starts to say, stop trying to do that so much. You need to focus on the sheep, because everything's about them. Everything's about the remnant, the elect of God.
I don't want to be irresponsible about evangelism, because he chose the people and the means.
Okay, and the person who played this on Twitter, that's their little ding in there, and I can't get it out of there. And so what he says there is, I don't want to discard, evangelism here, because God has chosen the people. I wrote it down. Because God has chosen the people and the means. Okay, that's what he says there. And this is oftentimes what's brought up when you ask the question, okay, Calvinists, why would we even evangelize? What's even the purpose of evangelism if God has elected whoever's going to believe and be saved anyway? If he's irresistibly going to draw his elect to himself, regardless of how involved I personally am, then what does it matter if I evangelize? And the Calvinist will often reply with, well, God has preordained the ends as well as their means. That's often what you'll hear, which doesn't really answer the problem. All it does is restate Calvinism. It's just a restatement of determinism. God determines the ends and their means. And so if you're active in evangelism, it's because God has ordained you to be active in evangelism. If you're inactive in evangelism, it's because God has ordained you, for whatever reason, to be inactive in evangelism. And so their answer is pretty much, well, God determines whatsoever comes to pass. And so God has ordained the ends and their means. And so if you're going to ask, should I be involved in evangelism or not? Their answer is basically, well, if God's ordained you to, that's basically all that's saying. And so this is what's kind of crazy to me, because Tim Keller and Andy Stanley, say what you will about them. One of them is a Calvinist, one of them's not, by the way. So this is not about Calvinism necessarily. Tim Keller is a Calvinist, though many of his sermons you would never know it, because he didn't talk consistently like a Calvinist at all, except if he's talking about Calvinism. But you could say what you want about Tim Keller and Andy Stanley. They have been very, 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 very effective pastors in reaching the culture, in reaching lost people. Very effective. If probably in the two put together, especially in the top three of the most effective pastors in reaching this culture, in reaching and impacting people in this world. Now, again, you may not agree with everything they say or the way they do things and some of their methodologies. That's for another discussion. Fine. But they have impacted a lot of people in this world today. Okay, so here's the question I have for someone like John MacArthur: if God has ordained the ends and the means, and Andy Stanley and Tim Keller are the means that God has ordained to save at least some of the elect, you have to believe that at least one elect person has been saved through Andy Stanley's ministry in the decades he's been doing what he's doing. You've got to believe that that Tim Keller, and I mean Rick Warren, you've got to believe that at least one elect person has been saved through those means of those people, right? So why would you critique the very thing that you think God chose as the means to bring those elect people to salvation? That's what doesn't make sense to me. It does make perfect sense for a provisionist or a traditional Southern Baptist to critique the means when the means are not consistent with the biblical mandate and the biblical methodology being proposed. It makes perfect sense for us to critique it because we would say, hey, God can use those erroneous means to bring somebody to salvation, despite the fact that they're erroneous or they're corrupt or that they're not godly means. And you should stop doing those things because we don't believe God sovereignly and unchangeably, meticulously decreed those means. So it makes sense for me to critique them. It makes sense for Adrian Rogers or A.W. Tozer to critique the downgrade. It does not make sense to me for somebody who holds consistently to a deterministic soteriology and a deterministic worldview to critique those things. And that's been the critique that I bring. Now, again, I know Calvinists are going to come back and say, well, it's because of secondary means. You don't understand the difference between primary and secondary causation. Well, go back and listen to my discussions with Eric Hernandez and other philosophers, Braxton Hunter and Tim Stratton. We critique their explanations too, okay, from the philosophical side of how that does not work. And compatibilism. Search up compatibilism at YouTube, on our YouTube channel. And we will go through how the compatibilistic arguments, the philosophical arguments from the theistic determinists, don't hold water in our estimation or in the estimation of many more, much better trained philosophers than I'll ever hope to be, at least. So if you're thinking that that's what I'm here to do is to lay out every single philosophical argument against compatibilism or the philosophical findings of Calvinists, I'm not in this episode. I've done it elsewhere. So unless you think that I haven't been willing to entertain those thoughts or those arguments, go actually listen to the other broadcasts where we address those arguments.
But I think ministry has been woefully lacking to the souls of the people of God.
By divine decree. Okay, just let that sink in. Ministry to the elect, the remnant, has been lacking because these pastors are focusing so much on reaching and impacting the culture, reaching the lost, making disciples of all nations. They're so much focused on there. What they're neglecting is the remnant. They're neglecting feeding the sheep. By divine decree, if what you believe in the Westminster and London Baptist Confession of Faith, which your church promotes, then God has ordained and sovereignly and unchangeably decreed for pastors to focus too much on reaching the world than they should. And that doesn't make sense to me. That's the point I'm trying to bring out here.
And so they have struggled and they have been wounded. They have been without biblical teaching, without solid doctrine, without nourishing truth.
Why would God decree for that to happen, MacArthur? Why is God sovereignly and unchangeably decreed for the remnant, the elect, to be so neglected like that? Again, that's what doesn't make sense to me.